Thank you so much. Like within rhetoric or within foodways, all these arguments are familiar. Different crew, I guess. So.
Break a leg.
Hey, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
I remember I did a public talk for Tennessee State Park once, and it was in this like tiny little room along the Trail of Tears, actually.
Oh wow!
And that's what they wanted me to talk about. And I had such a weird gamut of people, and I had like the most off the wall questions.
Yeah, I'm kind of worried about that.
And sometimes I just like had to shake my head like, I don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because I had sort of some elderly people who had, I guess, grown up on a different narrative of the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
And didn't necessarily follow where my points were going. And so it really, the park ranger who was there helping him and organized it, he was very helpful in sort of guiding things back sort of on track.
Oh, good.
But every once in a while, there's somebody who
you can redirect. Maybe you raise your hand for me. Hey, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good. I brought Mary. You remember Mary?
Yeah.
And this is my neighbor Pat. I invited her.
Hey,
as well.
Pat. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming. Yes, Mary. I remember.
I
Yeah.
gave you a hard time over your name. I remember that.
Oh, that's right. I've forgotten. Hi.
sorry.
Thanks. Hello, and her friend Mary. Okay. This is Karen.
Nice to meet you.
Who is this?
This is Kate. This is my daughter.
What's it again?
Kate.
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 Her granddaughter's Kate.
Oh yeah, she's a Kate pretty quick. She's 8. Oh.
So it's mine.
Yeah. She's named after a great grandma. Collier. Family name. Yeah, my mom is here somewhere with that name. So,
You're going to deliver it with you?
she wants to someday, right, Kate? Yeah, she probably could. Thank you for coming. Hey, I like your tag.
Congratulations.
Thanks for coming out, because I know you've got 1,000. I go in the south entrance of campus, so I never even, which is probably a better thing, actually.
She said, I said, you know if it's boy or girl yet? She said, you got to tell me. She said, you got my girl right.
No, isn't it nice? I'm surprised I could see you guys from.
No, this one.
Yes, I am. So wait.
Yeah. It was in the bar, so that's
Looks
back
good.
then you're gonna be dressed. I said, but the first one that gets dressed gets a $5 bill.
That's all. I wonder when I was upstairs. You help out, okay? Oh, between the grandmas? Yes, thank you, Nani. I owe you all a bottle of wine after this. Just say, hey, how are you? Ashley is fine.
I can't wait for this.
Oh my gosh.
So
Well, I don't. Is it good? I know. We're gonna have one of those.
Good stuff. I'm going to do that little
I know. They texted me that they were coming.
Presentation.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Well, sure.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Sure. I'm looking forward to this.
Good, good. I haven't seen you in a while. I think, you know what, I am maybe teaching in the same building as you on Thursdays at yes.
Yeah, right.
And I walked by and you were with one student. I don't know if you're doing like a comps prep or something, but it would seem very intense, so I didn't stick my head in. So, hi, how are you?
This is Ashley.
Yeah. Let's see, what's your name again? I'm gonna go figure out where to put my water.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. This is the 8th season of the Personally Speaking series. And as you probably know, in this series, UNC Charlotte College of Liberal Arts and Science faculty present some of their latest work, some of their latest books to the community as a way to engage more in terms of the university and the community discussing important topics. And tonight's going to be one of those nights. The series is supported by CLAS, which is the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, as well as Atkins Library at the university. And the library, by the way, is open to the public. So if you're not a university member, you are absolutely welcome to come to the library, and they have a fabulous rare book room collection. They also have a new visualization lab that people might be interested in. Tonight is also sponsored by Jerry Cotter, Executive Director of the building we're in tonight, UNC Charlotte Center City. Thanks go to all of you for coming, to the community, to UNC Charlotte, who really made this a success over the past 8 years. We have student volunteers. I'm not sure if you're in the room right now, but they'll be coming in from communications in English and helping us, especially through the Q&A section. Tonight's the first of 4 talks for this academic year, and you may have gotten your bookmarks. I love bookmarks. If you don't have one, you can get one on the way out tonight. The next talk will be November 14, when Dr. Eckerd from the English department will discuss her book, Thomas Wolfe and the Lost Children in Southern Literature. There are 2 in the spring. Dr. John Cox is going to be speaking about issues of genocide. Dr. Christopher Cameron is going to be speaking about the role of African Americans in the anti-slavery movement. And this has all the dates for that. Just like tonight, 6:30, this room, this building. If you're not familiar with the format tonight, Dr. Stokes will speak. Then we'll have a Q&A. Then we're welcome to go back to the reception where all the food will be back out again, as well as the wine. And there'll be books on sale, and Dr. Stokes will also be able to sign them. Okay, about Dr. Stokes. Dr. Ashli Stokes received her doctorate in communication studies from the University of Georgia. After 2 years as an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, she joined UNC Charlotte in 2006. She's currently an associate professor in communication studies, and she also serves as the director of the Center for the Study of the New South. Dr. Stokes' scholarship has appeared in prestigious public relations and rhetoric journals. She's received the Janice Hawker Rushing Early Career Research Award, which recognizes emerging scholars who demonstrate exceptional records of production and impact. Dr. Stokes' research also dovetails with the Center for the Study of the New South's mission to promote dialogue on issues related to the New South, and tonight's discussion is a case in point. Dr. Stokes' book, Consuming Identity, The Role of Food in Redefining the South, was published by the University of Mississippi Press. It's a result of the partnered research on food and regional identity by Dr. Stokes and co-author Dr. Atkins Sayer, who's an associate professor at the University of Southern Mississippi. A reviewer of the book says, quote, Consuming Identity demonstrates that food can be used to tell powerful stories about who we are and who we wish we could be. This scholarly take on Southern food and identity construction is served alongside hearty portions of optimism. I love that line. The authors offer a compelling vision for regional progress, speculating that communion around the table might build a more equitable future, which is clearly a worthy goal. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Ashli Stokes.
Thank you all so much for coming and taking time out of your day to be here. I greatly appreciate it. And we're having, we're going to go back to the beginning of my slides in just a second. Justin, if you would, please. But I am very excited to be here, and I want to thank, I know there's lots of thanks going on, but it's one of the things that I really would like to do for just a minute before I tell you the story of this book. I'd like to thank my chair, Dr. Jason Black. I don't know where Jason is at the moment. Thank you very much for supporting us in the Department of Communication Studies and the Personally Speaking Committee as well. Susan Jatan and the team from CLAS has done a great job in getting this event ready for us, and I appreciate Lynn and Susan very much in Center City as well. And of course, I have to thank my family because without all of them and them giving me time to work on this book and babysitting a lot, there are two small children in the front rows. Kate is 8 and Charlie just turned 4 yesterday. And our dueling mom team that supports my husband Jeff and I, they've been very helpful for us in giving us the time and the space to create this book. So we thank you very much. But what I think is really neat about this opportunity is, so this is personally speaking, right? And so I'm supposed to kind of tell you the story behind the story. And this is something that actually I think works with that format quite well, because Wendy, my co-author, and I went on quite a journey in order to write this book. So what I'd like for you to do for the next few minutes is just sort of take a trip along the road with me and how we wrote this book. And I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the findings that we experienced. So my co-author and I went to University of Georgia together, as Paula mentioned, and we both looked at social movement rhetoric. And at the time, Wendy was really interested in the animal rights rhetoric of PETA. You might have heard of them before. I looked at a bunch of different social movements, particularly through a public relations lens. I looked at anti-smoking movement. I looked at how feminism spread in the 1970s outside of Roanoke, Virginia. And if you know anything about Roanoke, for second wave feminism to go anywhere kind of takes a lot. And so after graduate school, we never wrote together, but we always had this kind of interest in how it is that people are motivated to support a social movement or not. And so when I got to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, I began to be interested in the slow food movement. And if you're not familiar with slow food, they are a movement that started in Italy, and their mission, it's a worldwide movement, is to get people to move away from industrial, agricultural, and processed food. And so my work at UNC Charlotte kind of was my sort of dipping my toe into food studies. And so I wrote a small grant proposal at the time, and I said, you know what? It would be really cool if I could actually go to Italy and talk to the public relations team on the ground. And I think it's really important that I do some interviews. And miraculously, it was granted. So that started a series of really fun trips that I got to take. This is the Slow Food headquarters outside of Bra, Italy, and it's this awesome restaurant where everything is from scratch. This is a winery that I went to, and I speak very poor Italian, and I tried to conduct an interview with this slow food themed winery, and I just had to give up because it was my first go at this. My Italian is terrible, and so I learned a couple things about how to conduct an interview. And so I also tried to take on the same trip a pasta making class, and I was really bad at that as well. And Jeff got to come along, but we decided that we had a lot to learn about studying food. And one of the things that this early trip taught me, though, is that I study rhetoric, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but a lot of times rhetoricians study words on the page. And when you start thinking about food, I was like, well, how am I going to really study this? And how am I going to experience the stories and the message of food? So it's kind of like the first sort of, bell in my mind. And so then I decided that after this paper was published that I wanted to look at American food movements specifically. So I love Southern food. Maybe you do too, since you're here. And so what I decided to do is look at the Southern food movement in particular. And so the premier organization that studies Southern food is the Southern Foodways Alliance. And so I decided to write another grant proposal, and I asked to go to an event for the Slow Food Alliance in Tennessee. And I wanted to see how it is they're working to tell the stories about food in the American South. So that was my first kind of foray into the slow food movement. And so Wendy and I met up later after this event at the Southern States Communication Association. It's one of our disciplinary regional meetings, and we were sort of walking around talking. And this was in Little Rock, which is the headquarters of Heifer International. If you're not familiar with them, they're a social movement that tries to get families and communities out of poverty, but rather than handing someone a cup of milk, they would give a community in a different country a cow or a goat or things like that. So it's very sort of self-sufficient model, if you will. So we're walking around this awesome building and we're talking, and all of a sudden we're like, wait a minute. We never had written together. And so we went back to the hotel, and that's the first time we actually sat and wrote a kind of very beginning outline of the book. And so we had the outline, and we started writing conference papers. And what was really interesting, we first talked about cookbooks, and then we talked about Southern desserts, and then we talked about barbecue. And every conference that we went to, when we would talk about these papers, people really would just sort of open up. And they wanted to smile, and they would tell us their stories about their experiences with barbecue and so on. And we got this idea like, hey, you know what, maybe we're on to something. Maybe we should keep going with this project. And so then we submitted at each of our universities another grant, and we asked to be able to have some travel funding, not all of the funding, but some funding to help us go on a road trip. And so what you're going to hear tonight is we traveled through 10 different southern states to collect our research. And I'm going to tell you about some of what people told us on the road about their experiences and why Southern food matters to them and how they think it communicates. So 5 years later, roughly, we have a somewhat finished product. But really, I have to say, the story goes back further than that. So my mother tells me in the front row that I can't tell you much about my childhood. I have a terrible memory. But she says I can tell you what we were eating, and that's actually pretty true. So this expression on my face, I think I'm mad because they wouldn't let me eat my birthday cake. I think I have a very abnormal sort of fascination with the fish that my dad caught in his cool 80s mustache. I don't know what's going on with this image. And then this is a photo of my cousin and I in an actual back of a pickup truck talking about Southwest Virginia. And what we're doing, and Mom can correct me, but we're waiting for the family reunion food buffet to start. And I thought about it. I'm like, why do I remember this image so much? And I kept thinking about this talk. I was like, why does this stick with me? And what it is, and this is the image that was on the screen for you a little bit, is I have a very specific, I like to think that I remember this event, but I'm like probably, 4, 5, Charlie's age maybe. And I don't think I remember the event. I think I remember the food of the event, possibly, but I remember the image of that event. And so this is one of our scholars in rhetoric, and what she's talking about is it's the image that sticks with you. And I didn't know it, of course, as a child, but what that image is doing is it's being rhetorical, right? It's sending a message. It's talking to me at the time about what food means in terms of my family and my community and the sort of who my family is in this little corner of Southwest Virginia. And so when we study in our project about how food communicates and how it shapes who we are, our identity, we are using a rhetorical lens. And I want to be really clear that if you ask me how to make something or you want me to cook for you, I'm probably not your person. I'm not a historian of food. We study messages. So when you look at rhetoric, you're looking at the rhetorical content. When we are trying to persuade and we're trying to shape someone's opinion about food or their thoughts about food or their beliefs about food, that's what my colleagues and I study. So a lot of times we'll look at very specific words on pages, or something very explicit maybe is another word that you could use. So like a tweet, or a speech, or a political ad might be a good example. Or one of our colleagues looks at how the NFL communicates right now about the protest, for example. Okay, so we can look at rhetoric that way. But we can also look at how language and symbols, really how anything influences us. And I think that's really important to do when you're studying food. And so we're looking at how the words and symbols that we use when we talk about food communicate to us and speak to us. And that's the approach that we decided to take in this study. So that's overall what we were sort of after. But in terms of rhetorical studies, like I say, lots of people talk about food, but it's kind of new in rhetoric. So we needed, in terms of a discipline, we needed a method, okay? And so we had to think about how it is that we read food. And we didn't really have a lot we had some guidelines to follow, but we kind of had to honestly pull a bunch of different disciplines together to do this project. So this is a picture of Weaver D's in in Athens, Georgia. This is this awesome soul food restaurant if you've ever been there. Aaron, I see you smiling up there. And so we thought about, well, how do you read this experience? This is one of the first places we went. So if you look at the table and you look at the hot sauce on the table and you look at how casual it is and you see the sign with the plastic letters, well, how do you account for that? And so we started thinking about we needed to study foodways, and if you're not familiar with foodways scholarship, it has to do with the study of why we eat, what we eat, and what it means. And you really, we think, have to look at the stuff of Southern food. So like, what does a cast iron skillet mean? What does the iced tea pitcher mean? What does the hot sauce bottle on that table mean? So as we traveled through the 10 different states, we probably ate at, and I was pregnant for part of the time, so this was awesome, but we probably ate at 100 different restaurants, dive bars, farmers markets, gas stations, you name it, we ate it. And we tried to really talk to people as we did so. And as we did that, we wanted people to tell us their stories and their memories about food. And we really tried to get them to talk through sort of what we called a rhetoric of the senses. So what do you see when you walk into Doe's Eat Place in Greenville, Mississippi? Has anybody been to Doe's? If you're ever in Greenville, Mississippi, the Delta, please go, because you walk in and your sight, you walk through someone's kitchen that is the restaurant, and people are grabbing wine glasses out of the cabinet and beers out of the cooler, and what you see shapes what you are experiencing. We try to think about the role of touch. So if you go to an oyster roast and you're shucking the oyster, it's tactile, it's messy. We try to think about the role of sound, so we can hear the sizzle of bacon in a pan, and so on. And we talk, of course, taste is going to play a big role. And one of the things that really surprised us is just the taste of simple Southern foods. One of my favorite things was just a tomato salad with salt, and it was bourbon-infused pepper, and it was awesome. And it was just really interesting to kind of read food through the senses and try to think about what it is. So what we ended up with after sort of applying this method is we had a book that roughly follows the course of a meal. So we start with our drinks, and then we go through sides and appetizers and desserts, and then we have after dinner conversation about what we think this means. And so that's roughly what I'm going to do the rest of the time tonight. But then we ran into an even bigger problem, and that is, how do you talk about what food means and our stories about food in the South, right? And when I don't need to talk about all of the issues and problems in our country and in the South in 2017. And the South's particular history of slavery and racial segregation and violence and sexism and all of these things. Some of them are past history, some of them are current history, and some of them are stereotypes. So, people talking about Southerners eating all fried food, But you have to kind of think about what food does within what we would call the rhetorical situation, or the environment, the context in which we're writing. But after we kind of came up with or cobbled together a method and thought about the rhetorical situation, what we did, or the context, is we make 3 arguments in the book. So one of these I've already talked about, and that is that food acts rhetorically. And so we send messages when we serve or when we eat food, whether it's intentional or not. So that if I go to Price's Chicken here in town, or if I'm at the family barbecue, that experience is very different than if I were to go to Barrington's here in town, a fine dining restaurant, or Kindred up in Davidson, or have a meal at the Myers Park Country Club. It's communicating in a different way. It's sending different messages. So what is that message that it's sending? And so I've already talked a little bit about this, but the second argument that we make is that food serves this identity building function. So if food tells our story and shares our messages, we think it's reasonable to assume it makes us who we are. So who are the identities that we have? And I'm going to go through some examples with each of these. And finally, we think that food provides an opening, a door to open up dialogue in the region between groups who maybe have had or continue to have division in the past. So in the South, which has it's plagued by lots of social issues and a dark history, that maybe food can give us an opening to get to know somebody else and to start a conversation about what we have in common, perhaps. So we argue, in essence, that food speaks. And so the rest of the time, what I'm going to do tonight is just take you through some of the examples from the chapters to lead you through some of these arguments. So my first example is actually from my sides chapter, so I'm sort of going out of order, but a lot of us like and eat cornbread. And we think this is one of the dishes that sort of exemplifies the South's sort of regional and cultural differences. And so Southerners tend to have very strong feelings about cornbread. So I would like for you to raise your hand if you put sugar in your cornbread. Okay? All right. Raise your hand, please, if you do not. Aha. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But that preference is showing us or communicating to us how food is very personal. And this became more and more apparent to me when Wendy and I were talking about how each of us, our mothers, had taught us how to make cornbread. I'm like, no, 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 no. First, wait, you're putting, no, you don't put sugar in your cornbread. Her family has a German influence, so she puts a teeny little bit. I'm like, no, that's wrong, right? You can't, that's not, but in other words, it's very personal to you. And I have all these recipes, and I have a handwritten binder of recipes I collect. And so I had tried to write down my mom's cornbread. It's 3 ingredients. That's it. Cornmeal, egg, or cornmeal, oil, and buttermilk. And I couldn't get it right. And I kept trying, and I finally figured out it's the process of making the cornbread and going through the ritual that I had to get right before I could sort of master my family's cornbread. And so what we found, though, is that personal story, and I feel like I've gotten it, my kids eat it even, I feel like I've gotten it right, that story, when we went throughout the South and we were interviewing people, people kept talking about how personal food was to them and how it meant something for them to be able to master, the family recipe. So food is all rhetorical, so I've talked to this a little bit, but I think a good example to explain how this works is the differences between biscuits and cornbread. So, both of these things, I think, in the South have this sort of, down-home country cooking nostalgia, maybe, for a past that either existed or never really existed. But what one of the scholars in Foodways talks about, how in the late 19th century, there was a movement in the South to get primarily white women, in this case, to move away from making cornbread. Because at the time, cornbread's rhetorical message was that it symbolized disease and poverty. Again, 3 ingredients in our Appalachian cornbread, right? None of them terribly healthy. Backwardness. And so that biscuits, when you use your white lily flour, are much more class conscious and much more appropriate. So when we eat a biscuit today, we're not rejecting, our Southern kind of gritty roots, but this is just an example of how food can be a message or a harbinger of particular strategies. And so this, in this case, about class. This is Ben Burkett. He's also one of the folks that we found out his story as part of this. And he is a farmer in Petal, Mississippi, outside of Hattiesburg. And what Ben is doing is he grows collards and sweet potatoes and watermelon as some of his primary crops. And so historically, what Ben was growing was very sort of considered to be kind of make-do foods. And the make-do foods are the cuisine of the South because of the region's poverty, isolation, because historically we had, until recently, it's been building, a lesser amount of immigrants than other regions of the country. We had a cuisine that grew out of this that for a lot of time, people wanted to kind of move away from. And what Ben and some other farmers in Mississippi are trying to do are now to preserve this history and to honor this history and to be able to make a living out of farming these traditional Southern foods that come out of the history of the South. And what we found to be interesting is a lot of our interviews would talk about things like, we want to go back to homestead, or the phrase that we'd use is coming back to homestead, and making these simple foodways a way to sort of celebrate the good parts of the South. And so what we talk about is food is an example of our history. It helps us understand our history, but it also shapes our understanding of the South's history. Food also reflects culture. So this is a story that ran in the Charlotte Observer. Kathleen Purvis talked about the differences between African Americans and whites sometimes over their use of sugar and cornbread. So I'm back to my question about sugar. And so we came upon an interview with a local Alabama celebrity, and her name was Catherine Tucker Wyndham. And Catherine is very anti-sugar in cornbread. And so she said, I have to read this to you, that sweet cornbread is a terrible cooking error, and that she will lead an active campaign to keep sugar out of cornbread. It's as Southern as anything I can think of, she said, and it should not have sugar in it. And I'm trying to find the source of this desecration. People have strong feelings about cornbread. And so what was really funny about this is Kathleen in her article in The Observer talks about how sugar can, the use of sugar, the lack of sugar, can reflect, of course, your financial status, right? It's a way to either show off a little bit that you have the sugar, or that you can still create a good cornbread without sugar, so it can reflect that. But what Michael Twitty does, he's another Foodways scholar, he talks about how cornbread, the use of sugar or not, also reflects regionalism and race. So that when African Americans moved to cities like Chicago following the Great Migration, perhaps they didn't have access to the cornmeal that they maybe used in the South, so maybe it wasn't as good as the product they were used to, and so they used a touch of sugar to make up for that lack of inferior cornmeal. And what's interesting about that to me, and what Twitty talks about, is it's a lot, this discussion about sugar or not sugar is really an argument about who gets to call Southern, Southern, right? Because when we are saying that sugar, cornbread shouldn't have sugar, maybe that's the white version of the South. And so what Twitty argues is we need to talk and listen to all of the different stories and reasons about why we put sugar in our cornbread or not. Okay, so enough with the cornbread. We're going to move on. Unfortunately, I did not get to go to this particular, this is a bourbon distillery, it's not Jim Beam, in Kentucky. Wendy went on this when I was pregnant. I could have gone, but I decided not to because it would just not have been fun. And because I like bourbon, and I'm probably going to have one after this. And what we started thinking about is, well, how do drinks communicate? And so, it makes a difference sometimes whether someone comes to your home if you offer them a bourbon versus a sweet tea, right? So at the most basic level, what you serve in your house is about maybe making connections, slowing down, sitting down, and enjoying a drink together. But it also says something about your identity. So if Wendy drinks a Lone Star beer, that's about her identity as a Texan. And here in Charlotte, we're very proud lately of all of our local Charlotte beers. So we're talking about being, Charlotte's this new South City, that we're creating our identity through the drinks that we have. And so what we started thinking about is how drinks can serve as a type of invitation. And this is Terry Jordan. He is a bartender in Hattiesburg. He works at several different bars. And he was talking about, he thinks that Southern drinks in particular send these messages of welcome, relaxation, hospitality, and connection. So I want you to hear, hopefully, Justin, if you could play what Terry had to say about Southern drinks.
I think Southern cocktails is not the basis of just getting drunk. I mean, it's the basis of just relaxing, taking time, slowing down. Even though we do lead a slow life already, it's that constant put the brake on. Work's not an issue. Home's not an issue. Let's just slow down for a minute and enjoy what's here. Enjoy what's good. And just the frivolity, just the people, when they congregate and come into a bar or a restaurant, doesn't mean it's one of those social things. It's a beautiful thing. It's like a painting. You see so many different things.
Acoustic singer-songwriters and rock bands unplugged.
I think all that goes into the drink. What you choose for a person to drink. If they have the confidence and trust you enough to say, make me something. That makes me feel good.
Isn't that interesting? Because I don't know if you can hear that, and we had to tape our interviews. We're in coffee shops, and they're not always the best quality, but he actually got emotional when he was talking about his feelings about how drinks can serve as a form, and he was very happy about his ability as a bartender to offer that to people. But we talk a lot about hospitality, that chapter, and it's not always this sort of rosy, sunny thing, and the same messages of welcome and hospitality can also be used to close off certain groups of people. So, I may or may not invite you into my home or onto my porch and so on and so forth. So hospitality in the South is this message of welcome, but it also sometimes can have a deeper, more complex meaning as well. We also looked at drinks as performance. I told you we got to go to some really terrible places on this trip, and this is the Sazerac bar in the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans, and the bartender there is making a Ramus Gin Fizz, which is a highly performative drink, and it's delicious if you've ever been able to have one. And, you know, they're famous also for the Sazerac, and it's a very involved process. And Terry said this too, that our Southern drinks can be about tradition, about memory. He said, you know, we have a lot of traditions here, some good, some bad, but we still have it. And we argue in the book that our drinks are a way to talk about what the South is and maybe what we want it to be. I'm going to switch over to the main course now and keep moving through our chapters. And so when we came to talking about entrees, we had these conversations about, well, what are we going to feature? What's our main dish? And we came back to the idea of barbecue, because of all foods, we feel like barbecue really reflects a sense of the region. And in fact, the chapter deals with North Carolina barbecue, because it has so much to say about these little micro differences that we have in culture. And one of the things that we talk about is, I hate to say this, but I think this picture is actually Dreamland in Tuscaloosa. But what we talk about is barbecue sends messages of authenticity, such that Wendy and I have completely different views about what makes authentic barbecue. Right? I completely disagree with hers. Hers is beef, it's cooked over mesquite, mine is pork, it's over coals. And what we were talking about is this sense of authenticity often has a lot to do with what your family cooked and the community you're from. That this veneer of authenticity, when you start peeling it back, you know, there's no there in some ways. But either way, the type of barbecue that you prefer forms your identity. So if I argue with Dan, as I have, wherever Dan Grano is in the audience, we've argued about Memphis barbecue and how that is not my definition of authentic barbecue. But in that process, Dan and I have had several conversations that we feel creates a connection between us over our shared love of barbecue, just different styles. We also, in the book, talk about how barbecue speaks in a very masculine voice. I don't know if you can identify very many women-owned barbecue restaurants or women pit masters. There are a few. But we found that the masculine voice of barbecue to be true in our experience. So this is a picture of the Rocky Mount, North Carolina Barbecue Throwdown. Even the title of the competition is masculine. And Jeff likes to eat barbecue, and so he went with me when we spent a whole weekend eating barbecue. And so they're voting after the competition, this line of folks, and the People's Choice, what was their favorite. So when we were walking through the competition, there's this gigantic cooking apparatus and like tailgate on steroids, like people everywhere cooking their barbecue. And at first, no one was talking to us. And we've been doing this for a while. I kept like, this is kind of odd. Like, I wonder why people aren't talking to us. So Jeff's like, you know what, I'm going to go. So he wanders off. So I am in this sea of barbecue rigs. And all of a sudden, people start talking to me. And here, hold the camera. Here, have a bite of this. Here, do you want to take a closer look? The highly male environment, once this male was gone, started talking to me about all of the different traditions. And it was just one of these moments like, are you for real? This was just such a very interesting, very male-dominated environment. What we found, though, is like a lot of things in the South in terms of food, this is slowly starting to change. There is a female pitmaster named Helen Turner that we talk about in the book, who's in Tennessee, and she was honored by the SFA for her work in barbecue. And the products of barbecue are starting to change too, more sustainable, more humanely raised as well. But it's got this tradition of a masculine voice. We also argued about how barbecue sees value in the rural environment, our rural communities. This is a picture of, it's not a very good picture, but it's my very favorite barbecue place, bar none. And so I grew up about 2 hours from here, and so we would always go to Lexington Barbecue on the way to the beach. And so Mom made me a bet, and she said, I hadn't been in a long time, and she said, go in and ask if he can tell who you belong to by your order. All right, I was like, okay, I'll take this bet. So I go in and I say, hey, if I told you I wanted 2 chopped barbecue sandwiches with tomato, would you know who I belong to? And he said, oh yeah, you belong to that little lady with the salt and pepper hair who's always in a hurry on the way to the beach. Mom is right a lot of times, and I couldn't believe it. Right? It was just it was very interesting to me that it's such a small knit community that they could do that. So I went to Lexington Barbecue after I had gone to the Lexington Barbecue Festival, which if you haven't had a chance to go, it's in October. It's very worth your time. And I want you to hear an example from the Barbecue Festival, because if anything is rhetorical, this clip is rhetorical. So Justin, if you could help us, please.
Let's pause and give thanks. On this beautiful and glorious day, we are reminded, O God, of how often you gather your people around a table. And it's always a big table, overflowing with extravagant delicacies. A table surrounded by the blessings of community, of freedom, of peace, equality, hope, and joy. And today your people are gathered around a big, big table, overflowing with our iconic delicacy of delicious barbecue. And it's surrounded by the blessings of community, of freedom, of peace, equality.
And he says, enjoy. And so I'm sorry that I didn't get the snippet quite right. But what's interesting about that is you can either view that message as kind of corny, as kind of small town, as kind of not reflective of North Carolina in 2017. But what we found is there's a lot of inclusivity in that message. There's a lot of warmth and infectiousness. When you go to this festival, they really want you to feel their excitement about their delicacy. And so we think it's more interesting than it might appear on the front. And so, you know, it's valuing these sort of rural communities as having meaning and complexity in today's culture. So you're probably getting hungry, so we'll move on to the dessert course. So I flew this pound cake across the country because I wanted to talk about it. But this is, it's a small neighborhood owned business. There's some women in our neighborhood who own Takes the Cake. And we started thinking about, well, if barbecue is masculine and Southern baking has a more feminine tradition, and we think it's important to shine a light on some traditions that are maybe understudied, undervalued. So we started to explore desserts in this case. And I wanted to see the same thing with cornbread. Did you all grow up eating pound cake? Do you remember who made it and how they did it? Have you ever thought about that? What we began to think about is this taste memory that can serve a connection. And Carol Lee and Jen would talk about how just through the bite of something that they could participate in a memory that they could share with others. So they talked about one of their favorite customers is a 96-year-old man. And he took a bite of their pound cake and he said, you know what? That tastes just like my grandmother's pound cake. And what's so fun about that to us is that's 200 years worth of memories in a single bite. And so when he tells that story to somebody else at their counter, they go to different flea markets around town to sell their cakes, you know, they're sharing memories about this experience. And so they also talk about little old ladies that would come up to them and be like, well, I make a 5-flavor pound cake, you know, and they would kind of joke around about how you know, Carol Lee's cake was good, but theirs was kind of, and so their ritual was a better ritual. But it's kind of like the barbecue thing, that sharing that story, even if you do it slightly different, creates a connection in certain cases. And what Carol Lee talks about, and this is sort of a long quote, but I think it's really interesting, is she talks about how that sometimes it's the passage of time that needs to take place before women or men, I want to make that argument in just a second, want to participate in that ritual. And so she talks about as her mom got older, you know, she didn't want to make the family specialties for a long time. And then as Carol Lee got older, she wanted to begin to engage in this. And so it's this passage of time that creates the connection and your willingness sometimes to participate in it. So Carol Lee here is specifically talking about the importance of baking historically to women, but we think it's not applicable only to women. What seems to matter is this willingness and time to pass before you want to participate in that ritual. And we learned about an associate editor for Food and Wine magazine. His name is Ben Mims, and he is a gay man from Mississippi, and he talks about how baking was the only thing that, even though his family, he moved to New York, and that even though his family condemned him, he felt like when he baked, he was still participating in a ritual that connected him to his family. And we thought that was a very interesting story to learn about. And so we also think that pound cake, or desserts in general, can affirm your community role, and particularly among the South's older women. We found that baking kind of affirmed who they are in today's culture, especially because the types of baking that that I'm about to share a clip with you, it's sort of apart from the norm. And so when women, the South's older women participate in these traditions, it's a way for them to still matter in a culture. And so I talked to Joanna Goff after I went to the Poplar Tent barbecue up in Concord. It's also coming up. It's really awesome. And I went there at first to research barbecue, but I was just flabbergasted at the dessert table. Like every single type of pound cake dessert you can possibly imagine. And I have a sweet tooth. I was like, this is great. But I asked Joanna at the barbecue, I said, can I talk to you about this? Well, where does all this cake come from? And so Justin, could you show or let them listen to what she had to say?
And her pies will go really quickly, we had this year, because she was only able to do 24, we had a couple come that afternoon and wanted, they don't know her, but they said, I know, not this past one, but the one before, a man came to the window and he said, you used to have a lady that made the best pecan pie I've ever tasted. And I said, yeah, she still bakes them, and we still have some. He said, I want 4 pecan pies.
Oh my gosh. What, does he think he freezes them?
Probably. But anyway, the word kind of gets out, and you have some people will come up and say, I want Margaret Ann's chocolate pie.
Right, so they're sort of known for their special thing.
Yeah.
And it was so funny in this exchange, she talks about how Margaret Ann that year could only, this cracks me up. Well, this year Margaret Ann only was able to bring 24 pecan pies. 24 pecan pie, and this just amazes me. But I think it's important to share these stories about women, and it's sort of essentializing or totalizing to say, oh, well, women bake, and that's stereotypical and that's essentialist. But we think there's more meaning to this, and we need to talk about these stories and share these stories. It's a celebration of the people who can still bake like this. That's not to say that baking always supports female subjectivity in empowering ways, and you can talk to my mom after this part of the evening about why she refuses to bake. She's a very good cook, but she's done with baking. And she's been there, done that, and it's over. And so, women we have the luxury sometimes of picking and choosing our relationship to bake. And so finally, pound cake, we also argue in the book, talks about or is able to send messages of welcome, that it can mend a broken heart, so that if you're at a funeral and the Methodists descend with their cakes and their casseroles, it's helping you out. It's sending a message of care sometimes in a time of crisis. And one of the scholars that we have in our discipline talks about how objects, and we took that to mean food, can serve as a type of equipment for living, right? It's something that can help you deal with the frustrations of daily life, so that we can, eat and we can bake and we can get away from our phones and that kind of thing. But we do, of course, live in a busy world, and I'm not telling you to bake. We have the luxury now where you can buy a really good homemade pound cake from someone, and you can participate in that ritual and that taste memory, even if you're not interested in actually baking or experiencing it. So what we talk about in the dessert chapter is in rhetorical studies, nostalgia and ritual are often looked down on as these sort of restricted kind of rose-colored glasses wanting to go back in time to a thing that really never existed. But we talk about, in this case, we think that there's some rhetorical, a trope that's got some promise to its potential that deserves some attention, to balance out a focus on male celebrity chefs and male-dominated Master Chef and Top Chef, that we need to tell more of these stories, and particularly from the voices in Southern food, the African-American women bakers that we talk about in our chapters that perhaps have not been included in as much in the Southern food story. So speaking of, what does this all mean? We wanted to share the message that Southern food is more than a stereotype, and it sends lots of messages, and it has a lot of meaning to it. And we want to look at more of these conversations, and we keep thinking about different ways we can keep this project moving in the future. But here in Charlotte, if you go down Central Avenue, you can experience the world in like 2 miles, right, or not even. There's a chorizo torta in the back of the Safeway grocery store on Central Avenue, where it's not a traditionally Southern food, but it's creating the Southern story, and it's becoming part of what Southern food is in today's world. So when we have things like boiled peanut hummus, which is actually really delicious, it's a Middle Eastern tradition that's combining with a Southern tradition in a new kind of mashup that can be really cool. So these oddball dishes like chile rellenos, my Spanish is terrible, stuffed with pimento cheese, you know, it's a new way, which is delicious also. It's a new way to participate in the Southern story, and it shows that the South is changing, and we hope becoming more inclusive of different voices. So we think that these boundaries can stretch and that they should stretch, and because we want to invite more people to the table and have conversations about our differences and our similarities. What this does not mean is it's important it became increasingly important to Wendy and me to make sure that we wanted to stretch that boundary and not claim that there's one way to define the South. So we're talking about redefining the South through food and the potential of food. You know, I don't have the line on what should be included in Southern food, but I do want to, to broaden that story. And as much as I want to claim that Lexington barbecue is the most authentic barbecue on the planet, I can't do it. And what became important to us, too, is the Southern food experience. So you can go to the K&W on New Year's Day, and you can participate in having collard greens and black-eyed peas. And, you know, a food critic might say, well, that's a chain, right? You can't go to Popeyes or Cracker Barrel or K&W cafeteria and have an authentic experience. But when we walked in that door and half of Charlotte from every walk of life who's too lazy to make it themselves were at the K&W on New Year's Day, they were very much having an authentic Southern food experience. So I think we need to interrogate maybe what that word means. So in the end, we talk about how the South is still here, but maybe not the one that we were expecting, certainly. Maybe not the one that you were expecting either. And this is Sheila Anderson, and I had the opportunity to go to a dinner. It was a recreation dinner of Nat Fuller. And Nat was an enslaved man who, after the Civil War in Charleston, started catering for all of these different, white Charlestonian families. And Nat Fuller's greatness had never really been explored or even really, people didn't know about it. So they had this competition in Charleston to relive the Nat Fuller story, and they went back into history, and they found all of the recipes that he actually made, and so they recreated this whole dinner, and it was really an interesting sight to behold. So Sheila is talking about, at this dinner, what she saw Southern food being able to do, and this was following, unfortunately, this shooting of Walter Scott in Charleston. And she said, we need to do more dinners like this because it's a way for us to talk about things in a less threatening, maybe uncomfortable, still uncomfortable, but less uncomfortable manner. And so for the social scientists in the room, they actually did a study about how food can make things more approachable, and this ran on NPR the other day. And they did an experiment where they had two volunteers, pairs of volunteers, and the volunteers had to decide on a wage that they were going to pay the third employee. So when the volunteers ate a sweet snack, one of them would eat a sweet snack, and one of them would eat a salty snack. It took much longer for them to come to agreement than if the pairs of volunteers both ate the sweet snack or both ate the salty snack. And, I think this is just an interesting phenomenon. And so we're wondering about the potential to lead us forward in creating a new South that's more, that echoes our changing people in the South, that's more inclusive and more diverse. And this is optimistic, yes. But I like to believe that it's possible. So the South is still here, but maybe not the one I was expecting. Thanks. So I'd like to open it up to questions, and Susan has asked me to ask you just to raise your hand so that our volunteers can bring you a microphone so that everybody can hear a question. So Janica, I see you in the back.
Dr. Lewis.
I just want to say thank you for your talk, and that first image of Weaver East is personally relevant because that's my uncle, but we did not grow up eating it because my grandmother cooked at home. So just thinking about how food circulates to the public
Cool.
I also wanted to ask you, how did you choose the restaurants when you went different places?
That is a great question, and that's one that definitely it morphed. And I forgot to say this earlier. I feel like when we came into this, I like to read about Southern food a lot. Our moms will tell us this, but I subscribe to all these magazines and blogs, and I read about food constantly. So at first, it was very kind of it was too fine dining, too restaurant driven. And we also realized at the beginning, too, that we were sort of acting like researchers, right? So we would walk in with all of our stuff, and people would just be like, you can't talk to, it was just, we weren't getting anywhere. So we revised the list of where we would go and how we would act as an academic researcher. It sort of kind of morphed along the way. But initially, it was, I think, kind of the more of the national and regional media about where to go. But we would just we started just pulling off where that things looked interesting to us. And we became much more broad as we went along. Other folks?
I'd be interested in hearing about your interpretation of the explosive popularity of Vivian Howard, who has a chef's life on TV and is sort of, you know, she's really taken over. Just in a couple of years.
Yes, so A Chef's Life is, I think, a wonderful show. It's on PBS. You can go to their website and watch. They're getting ready to start their 4th or 5th season. I forget which. But Vivian, the story of Vivian Howard is she is from Kinston, North Carolina, and her whole life she wanted to leave Kinston, North Carolina, so she goes to New York and she gets some experience as a chef. And her parents decide that she gets married and says, we will fund your restaurant, we'll give you some money to start a restaurant, but you have to come back to Kinston. So what the show does is they follow Vivian Howard's sort of ability to run this very farm-to-table-y restaurant in Kinston. I think, and this is, I think, shown in our research too, that it's partially, I think it has to do with, it's an American story, you know, she's sort of small town making it big, so I think that archetype is appealing. But also, I think that we live in a time right now where people like the message of comfort and familiarity that show shares, and that you see her talking to the residents of Kinston and interacting and using sort of local products and helping that town it used to be a tobacco town that was decimated, now it's coming back. So I think part of the appeal is it's sort of it's like almost like soul food or comfort food. You know, it's a balm. I think it's comforting to watch maybe.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Nancy.
Can you talk about children? Did you experience children's experiences with food?
We didn't interview any children. I think that in the sense that if you went to like the barbecue festival up in Lexington, I mean, kids are everywhere, and they're part of, I think, the Southern food story in that if you go to a particular type of restaurant, I mean, that it's family friendly. But no, I mean, that's an interesting direction that I hadn't thought about asking kids, you know, why they eat what they want. No, I haven't done that yet.
Oh.
Here. Oh.
Hello. Sorry. We know that you love Lexington barbecue, but
yes.
What would be your top 3 that you visited that wowed you?
Oh, man. Oh, gosh. That is a hard one. Okay. So, Okay, so if it can't be Lexington style, which has that touch of tomato in it, it's not ketchup-y, it's just a touch of tomato, and it's got the smokiness to it, I would then move to Eastern North Carolina, and I would go to we went to a place called Grady's that's like off this, some of you may have heard it, it's wonderful if you can Google Grady's. Literally 2 farm roads outside of, I forget the town in Eastern North Carolina, but it was just super delicious, very vinegary. Somebody may No? Yeah? Greenville, thank you, yes. Grady's, I think, is really good, and the other one is in Ayden, North Carolina, and they call it Skylight, thank you, and it's got like, Jeff likes Skylight a lot. They call themselves the barbecue capital of the country, and it looks like a little Capitol building. It's an amazing structure. So if I can't have Lexington, those would be my other two, I think. I can do two. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'll eat any kind of barbecue, really. But yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Karen. Okay.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay. I was just wondering, given your discussion about food as a way of communicating and experiencing community itself, and thinking about how technology affects that, like people having their phones with them during dinner, taking pictures of their food, not talking to one another. I was wondering if you addressed any of that at all.
I think that we certainly experienced it, because until we got out of our technology ourselves, we learned how much we were personally missing. I do think that it's a concern, I think, for building connection in today's world. It's one that I would like to look into more. But what we found is, for example, like at the Mallard Creek barbecue that we went to up the road, and the Lexington Festival. At the festivals, there's something else going on, because people don't have their phones out as much as they would at Kindred up in Davidson, and So I think it kind of depends a little bit on the type of experience you're having. So like in Weaver D's, you saw people walking in, and they would order from the counter, and they were having conversations. There were parents and students, and they were talking about what to order. So I think it kind of depends on, how I was talking about food sends sort of formal and informal messages. I think it partially has to do, not always, but partially has to do with the type of restaurant or experiencing that you have. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a wall that can be created through technology.
Yeah, you had mentioned about them going to your family or a group of people going to a chain restaurant to have collard greens and so forth, and then the comment was, well, that wasn't authentic, right? But I'm kind of curious as if that might speak to something, because chains, fast food restaurants, they're growing, they're spreading, they own the marketing, they have enough money to absorb all marketing. And they push consistency. So if you eat the same thing in Florida and you go to the same restaurant in California, it should taste exactly the same. Do you think that harms any sort of, an authentic taste in a region?
So we went into this wanting to hate on Popeyes and hate on Cracker Barrel, to be honest, because you're right. I mean, it's so manufactured, and we wanted to be like, well, this is not, this is coming from the back of a truck. This is not the real deal. But what we found is our definition of what Southern food, it became more about the ingredients you use and the conversation and the experience you have around them, rather than, again, trying to say, well, this is and this is not. So what I think that they've gotten particularly good at, I know there's a couple people in this room that think about this, I think they've gotten really good at, like you say, consistency and marketing that experience. So I think it's contingent on what you do in those spaces, but they're pretty savvy at designing, creating a Southern sense. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Ashley, I'm curious about whether you interviewed people who didn't grow up in the South but moved to the South, and how they experienced the new food.
Yes, we did, and we tried to, I'd say, open up the definition of Southern to be, quite broad, because I think it became more about whether or not you related to something about the food and about the cuisine. And what we found is that people would still, they would still find a connection. So if they were from upstate New York, and we're talking to them about Southern food, well, they were like, well, we don't do our, steak's not a great example, but we don't do our steak this way, but we do it this way. And so the same kind of, even if they didn't grow up in the South, that appreciation for the type of experience would often come up in conversation. So it kind of came, it's sort of, we don't eat exactly the same, but we kind of had this same experience around, you know, a hot dog from a cart in Boston or something like that. So the same sort of discussion would happen even if the food would change. And what's really cool about this is, I mean, this isn't just, you could do this with lots of different cuisines, right? We were talking about what's Southern here, but you could, you know, you could do this. I got back from Austria 2 days ago. You know, you could talk about the messages that Austrian cuisine sends, or what is Midwestern. So they're going to be slightly different messages, but I think they have the commonalities of bringing people together around a specific food. Does that answer your question? Okay.
You talked a little bit about the gender differences in baking, but could you talk a little bit more about some of your discoveries of gender in cooking? Because I'm sure with women a lot of the time being in the kitchen and that history of that in the South, I'm sure it was relevant as well. So could you talk a little bit more about those gender disparities?
So you're talking about cooking more broadly, or I'm sorry, could you?
Like just cooking in the Southern cuisine, like more of the gender differences that you saw.
Well, I think unfortunately the stories of women and African Americans in particular haven't been shared as broadly. So, you know, we hear a few years ago, you know, about Paula Deen and her cooking, but we don't hear about all the home cooks who have been in the kitchens for years and their stories aren't told. So I think it's more, in my opinion, about sharing the different types of Southerners, you know, not the wealthy Southerner story, the wealthy white, you know, and I am a white woman, but I think we need to make sure that those stories are shared. And I would say that I didn't say the one picture of the cookbook that's really kind of torn up in that one image, that is from a woman, Maeva Vass, who is she 90 now? 90? So she is a fabulous baker in the town that I grew up in Hillsville, Virginia, and she talked about how, I think a lot of the women that we spoke to talked about how they used food as a vehicle to express something to their families or their communities. So we heard a lot of language like, well, I bring the 24 pecan pies because I'm a member of this church and I want to participate. So it is sort of a stereotypical female, you know, taking care of others sometimes. But you still definitely hear that, or our interviews, you still heard that. Yes. Oh, sorry, I don't know who's. I can talk real loud. And I know Laurel's got her hand up too. I think they're coming to you, Pat.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I can't see.
Hi. You were talking about immigrant food and how it affects the food. And a lot of our foods came from Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered if we had not had that influence, what would we Southerners be eating? How would that be different?
Oh, gosh. I think, that's a hard one. But you know, another cuisine I would say that needs more attention in our culture is Native American cuisine. That's become, you know, I've talked to Jason, our chair, who does some of his research on Native American rhetoric, and I'd like to maybe go in that direction, so maybe he could help me out. But I think that you would have to, in terms of American cuisine traditions, I mean, that might be a direction to go in. Beyond that, I think the other European influences, but I think the recent willingness to talk about the African connections that we have in the way that dishes developed here is a positive sign. So I would say those two maybe. Laurel, yes. Well, as far as the Greek question goes, I think there is a very Southern Greek diner tradition. So in Jackson, Mississippi, it's the same kind of thing. There's a very developed Greek, I think, take on Southern food. So I think it's not just a Charlotte institution. I think it's broader. In our travels, you would see a lot of that the Greek proprietor sort of taking a spin on traditional Southern food. So yeah, I think that's a broader Southern thing. Beyond the South, I can't really speak to that because, yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so, you know, years ago, before the women's movement, before so many women went back to work, just about all women cooked at home, and they cooked from scratch, and, you know, very traditional foods, whatever their region was. But, and I'm kind of on the cusp. I mean, you know, my mom stayed at home, but I was kind of, you know, bridged it. But so many people I know, especially, you know, women who have been career women all their lives, they don't cook anymore. And they really just go through the frozen section in the grocery stores. So is home cooking going to come back, do you think? Or are we just going to, is it just going to be a professional matter where you go to restaurants or get takeout from good regional, you know, cooks?
You know, Wendy and I talked about this a lot because we are products of a time in history where our mothers were moving away from cooking all the time to, I'm not going to do this anymore kind of thing. And what I've had conversations with our interviewees about is how that type of home cooking has become more of a choice a lot of time. That we now, so Mom and I have talked about this, like I have the ability, I like to cook, but it's kind of on my terms. Whereas her generation, she felt like, and maybe Jeff's mom, that was something that you had to do. So I think it's become more of a choice. I think that there, again, is an interest that's developed in making foods from home and celebrating food. I think food is a big thing right now. But I don't know that it's ever going to have that same pull in culture broadly because people do have the luxury of, and it is a luxury sometimes, and we try to be careful about not, you know, sort of putting down the purchased pound cake or the mac and cheese from a box because we think that they serve a role. But I think what's popular is, and will continue to be popular, is the sort of weekend experiencing of cooking and participating in food that way. So I do think it's shifted a lot. I don't think it's ever going to go quite back to where it was in the 70s, for example.
Hello, I just attended a family reunion. We have it the fourth Sunday in September, and from my understanding, it's been going on for hundreds of years. Did you look at food as a dinner, as a and as identity and recognition? For example, you go through the line and say, make sure you get Joe's pie or Aunt Isabel's chicken pie. Did you look at anything like that?
Yes, definitely, particularly in the baking chapters. People were very specific about, I don't know if you can hear it, but you know, they're talking about, well, you need to get at the Poplar Tent Barbecue Margaret Ann's pie because it's the best of the chocolate pie or whatever it is. So yes, I think that it is a mark, and we would use the term, it's a mark of that person's identity, that he or she is known for their pulled pork or their pound cake or whatever. Yes, all the time people would say, well, my mom or whatever made the best in my family. Yes, I think it's an identity function.
My question is kind of pulls into the technology aspect. A lot of the foods that we're talking about in this conversation about Southern food are like barbecue, which is, you know, over coals, the cornbread that's cooked in an iron skillet. And so a lot of these traditional foods we see are being cooked in traditional manners with traditional equipment. Did you see any indication that some of these now celebrated old-fashioned foods might have a new technology moving into how they're prepared?
Yes, in fact, we looked at that issue a lot with the barbecue chapter, where there's this big debate. There's a map that you can actually buy. It's the North Carolina barbecue map, and they have these emblems on it. It's really, if you donate to NPR, you can get one, and they're really, I framed mine. Or Jeff framed it actually for me. But they have like these little icons that tell you where to go to make sure that your most authentic barbecue is prepared in this manner. And so it would be like a broken circle if it was done using gas, for example. So I think that I think the techniques are changing. I think traditional barbecue is definitely, at least according to the map and the research we did, it's becoming more difficult to find. But at the same time, I think that, you know, it's that sort of impulse that I'm trying to resist, where I want to say, well, this is always a bad thing, you know, because sometimes the technology, maybe it's more, in the case of barbecue, maybe it's more environmentally sustainable, or maybe, you know, they're getting meat from a different source that's more humanely slaughtered. So I think technology doesn't always have to be a negative thing, but yeah, I think that you see and that's why it's difficult to talk about authenticity again, because you can still have that experience even if the ingredients or the prep changes. Yes?
Did you look at all at how the advent of the supermarket is changing things? Because it strikes me, I cook, and it strikes me that cooking has a whole lot to do with what ingredients you have. And when you didn't have big national supermarkets distributing all kinds of different things around, you just had a local store that sold not local ingredients, but ingredients that people were used to cooking, had much more limited repertoire. You would cook those things, and therefore everybody would, I mean, cornbread, for example, where I grew up, you know, you might find some cornmeal, I grew up in the Northeast, and you didn't find cornmeal in the store much. I mean, it'd be there, but it wasn't a standard ingredient. Now, if you walk into the Harris Teeter here, you find poblano chilies, you find, you know, all these things that didn't used to be available in Charlotte, North Carolina, or anywhere, but they're all around the country, and there's this huge difference in terms of what you can cook. And see, does that affect things at all?
Well, I mean, I think you could say that it gives, I mean, you could go in a couple different directions with that. I think that it could contribute to some of the boundary stretching that I was talking about earlier, about how it allows you to do, you know, a take on a traditional Southern dish. Because now you can make it more Middle Eastern or more Mexican or whatever direction that you want to go in. And so I think there are some folks that would argue, well, this is a problem, right? Because then it's not mac and cheese anymore, it's lobster mac and cheese or whatever. But I think they're both delicious. So, I mean, I think that it's okay to open up these boundaries, you know, that you can have Vietnamese, you know, Gulf Coast Vietnamese food outside of Houston. You know, that's a different type of Southern tradition, but it is a Southern tradition, I think, that deserves attention. So I think, overall, I think it's I like this development. But yeah, supermarkets in general, we haven't really looked in specifically yet.
So I just wanted to say that your work is fascinating, and I'm really glad that you were able to give this talk. I learned a lot about your work in just your presentation. Something that's kind of resonating from the questions and then your responses, and I wanted to get your take on it, is that this notion of authenticity and this Southern authenticity, this adaptation of Southern foodways, this adaptation of what taste is in the South. And so I was wondering if you maybe see a correlation between that adaptation of taste in the different types of food in relationship to the different types of people that are moving into the South. And so maybe that adaptation of taste is in relationship to those people. Do you see that kind of translating into the acceptance of those people in the way that they're accepting some of their ingredients and that change?
You know, the hopeful side of me would say, yeah. I mean, I think that as those tastes kind of come together, that it, in terms of rhetorical message, maybe it does reflect a greater willingness, or at least an interest in getting to know another culture. So I would say, you know, I think, yeah, I think that we're seeing things more, you know, if food is a reflection of us, that we have all of these ethnic eateries in Charlotte and throughout the South. I think that's, you know, it's a, you know, again, we live in a very difficult time right now, but I think that that's perhaps a positive opening.
So my best friend's mom has life and death lasagna.
Anytime life and death lasagna.
Okay.
Anytime anyone is born or anyone dies,
Yeah.
you get a paneled lasagna.
That's a great title.
So did you, getting to talk to all of these people with all of their interesting stories, did you ever find that there are specific events that trigger specific foods?
Yes. So Mava Vass in Hillsville, yes. I mean, there's always like the particular type. In her case, she won she won a Southern Living. You know, someone sent in her recipe to Southern Living of her sour cream pound cake, but that's like the new baby cake, right? That she always brought to. And so finally, you know, they recognized her and she won for her baking. But that was her version of the life and death lasagna. And that's the story I think that's so interesting about this, because the dish changes, but the story is the same. So yeah, we did run into quite a bit of that. They're really fun. I love those stories. I think we have time for maybe one more. Yes. Our volunteers are on the move. Uh-oh.
So my family is from Decatur, Alabama, and my grandmother went to New York City when she was young, so this would have been in the 40s, bought turnips, went to the cash register, they cut off the greens, threw them in the trash can, and bagged her turnips. She was mortified, of course, because she was going to eat those greens. But now, in San Francisco, you have lines around the block to get chicken and waffles. In New York City, you can find all types of Southern food. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the movement of Southern food outside of the South.
Yes, and I think that I mean it's kind of it's sort of a popular, hot kind of cuisine right now, and I think it's the movement of not just Southern cuisines, but I think you see this as the country. We have all sorts of different cuisines kind of going everywhere, but I guess in terms of why Southern cuisine has become more popular, I think that it communicates messages of in some cases comfort and familiarity, and maybe a desire for a simpler, easier time. That in reality, it wasn't. The women who made these cakes, these are very hot kitchen, and it's very sweaty, back-breaking kind of work. But I think the perception is that that by eating these dishes, it's taking you back to maybe a safer, like a quieter, easier time. So I think maybe that's why it's really popular right now, because it communicates those messages, even though, again, I don't think that's always the reality. Yeah. So are you? Could you tell me what you're asking again?
I guess I'm confused at how this is regional Southern.
Okay. We went back and forth. It's a very good question. We went back and forth about this, and as we first, I think, entered this project, we would, in between restaurants or whatever, we were driving around and we'd say, well, all right, let's get our list of the Southern ingredients down. And then we couldn't really do that. And then, well, let's get our list of the certain practices that barbecue has to have. And then we would find ourselves being challenged on that. So I think that, again, what we try to do in rhetoric is talk about how these messages have come to convey Southernness, right? I can't put the line on saying, no, I'm sorry, that mac and cheese is my region only, right? But what I can say is mac and cheese has become a way for Southerners to talk about their identity. So I would answer it that way. It's just sort of how we have come to use whatever food it is to communicate about a particular region. So I think I would answer that way. All right, are y'all ready to eat some more? Thank you.